Hey, let's go ahead and get going here. I'm sure we'll find some other people joining us. So welcome to the Planning Conservation League's 2023 California Environmental Assembly. My name is Howard Penn. I'm the Executive Director of PCL. Our focus this year is going to be on extreme measures for extreme times. And I think everyone would agree this is not an understatement. For those of you that don't know PCL, since 1965, we've worked on statewide environmental issues and how to create healthy neighborhoods, communities, and a healthy planet. And we focus on land use, transportation, water, energy, wildlife ecosystems, and environmental laws such as CEQA, as well as a number of other topics, all that are impacted by the climate crisis or are contributors to the climate crisis. And for all of us that work in this climate change field, we have a massive job to do. And we appreciate your support, your participation, and your engagement in any way possible. So with no to do here, we'll move right into the sessions. We are pleased to have you join us today for two sessions with presentations and a discussion on aligning state mandates with local creativity. That's this morning's session from 9 to 10:30. And new housing law and sustainable communities, which is our afternoon session, what's working and what's not, from 10:45 to 12:15. So just to explain a little bit about our logistics here, some helpful information. For those of you that haven't been with us in past years, each day there are two sessions, one starting at 9 a.m. and the other at 10:45. You're able to join them using the same Zoom link and are welcome to attend as many sessions over the next 3 weeks as you would like. There will be a 15-minute break between each session, and you can leave the Zoom session running in the background or log back in during that break, whatever your preference may be. There will be a Q&A period at the end of each session. So if you would like to participate, please enter your question in the Q&A feature. That's the box usually at the bottom of your screen, depending on the type of system you're using, computer or tablet. We would like to reserve the chat box for comments only. So please keep your questions in the Q&A box. It makes it much easier for the moderator to manage those questions if the questions are asked in the Q&A box. These sessions are being recorded, and a link to those recordings and presented material will be emailed to you soon after the session, or you can find them at pcl.org/registrantinfo. That link I will put in the chat box as well, or Johnny, our coordinator, our event coordinator, can put that link in the chat box so you have that. That will be where we store all the information that we record. Any presentations or PowerPoint presentations that are made will be also stored there and archived so that you can go there anytime over the next month or more to get access to those things. There will be a feedback form that will be there once you leave the session, or we'll have it emailed to you. Please fill those out to us to let us know your thoughts. It really helps us plan for future assemblies and sessions that we do throughout the year. If you have any questions, please contact events@pcl.org. And if you would like to support PCL's assembly and our work in general, please consider donating at pcl.org/donate. I want to give a big thank you to all our sponsors. We couldn't do this without them. And we will especially thank our gold and silver sponsors, Chatton Brown, Carstens and Mintier, LLP, National Wildlife Federation, Sage Sweetwood, and Shoot Mahaly and Weinberger, LLP. Okay, let's jump into our first session. Aligning state mandates with local creativity. I want to thank and introduce our moderator, Doug Carstens, a partner with the firm, Chatton Brown, Carstens and Mintier, LLP, and the board president of the Planning Conservation League, which means he's my boss. It's all yours, Doug. Take it away.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Howard. And I'm quizzical on that part. Thanks for the welcome as the president, and welcome to everybody. It's really great to see people at least here on the screen or kind of gathering to give some thought to some of the really pressing issues facing California these days. I'd like to introduce our panelists in a moment, Ivanka Saunders and Beverly Palmer. But first, let me make a couple of remarks just to set this up or kind of get us started in thinking. If people want to ask questions, as Howard said, please do enter it in the Q&A or the chat. And we'll either take it during the panel if it's pressing at that point, or later toward the end in kind of a Q&A session. But as I say, we'll be monitoring that and look forward to interaction and participation as you would, or just feel free to sit back and listen. We're here for all that. So I'd like to start with this hot button topic right off the bat, wading into the thicket of how state control and local creativity interact with each other. How the state and local governments interact with each other on behalf of their constituents is a source of continual fascination and potential friction. I mean, as we all know, ideally, the two governments will cooperate with each other and they'd be working in the same direction at the same pace. State law on environmental issues for years has focused on protection, such as the California Environmental Quality Act or the Coastal Act or AB 32. Recent statewide efforts to address housing and greenhouse gas impacts have involved incentives or restrictions on local jurisdictions, and I think we'll delve into that a bit. Because of the nature of the system, the different levels of government have different priorities at different times. One potential arrangement is for the state to set minimum standards and allow localities to exceed them with additional requirements imposed at the local level to suit local conditions. An example of this model is CEQA, or the Planning and Zoning Law, which sets minimum requirements and allows local jurisdictions to do more. Oftentimes, some localities are captured by local interests, such as builders or developers, the corporations that complain about mandates from Sacramento to conduct environmental review or to treat people fairly or protect people that are living in these communities. Another potential arrangement is for the state government to set policies, such as with regard to greenhouse gas reductions or the provision of suitable and affordable housing, and require local entities to meet those policies by implementing measures at the local level to ensure they are accomplished. When such measures seek to take away or preempt local control to do other things, local jurisdictions have been known to push back, and we're seeing a lot of that these days. There's an interest in maintaining local control and democratic participation in government and having local voices heard in a democratic process. But some state legislation has seen that sort of local involvement as an obstacle to achieving state policies and try to reduce the number of local hearings that may be held or preventing the application of local standards through laws such as SB 10 or SB 330. ONV's Our Neighborhood Voices initiative and similar efforts have gained steam as a response to local or to state exertions of power, displacing or limiting local control. And we'll talk a bit about that more this morning. So we'd like to explore in our panel today how state mandates and local creativity have interacted in various contexts, and hopefully identify some themes of what works and what does not, what's been helpful and useful in achieving the broad public interest, and what has not. For our discussion this morning, we have two panelists to help us explore the nuances of these interactions as seen by people who work with the communities most directly affected by this interplay. I'd like to first introduce Beverly Palmer, partner with Stromwasser Wucher, based in Los Angeles, who is one of California's preeminent CEQA and election law attorneys. Beverly represents clients in the fields of election law and land use and environmental law, economic regulation, and education law. And really appreciate, Beverly, your being able to join us this morning. I'll turn to you in just a moment. I'd also like to introduce Ivanka Saunders, who is with the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. Ivanka is the regional policy manager working out of the Fresno office. I also want to mention, can I call it a starring role, or Ivanka stars in a film called Boxed In, which is about how CEQA is protecting public health. And Ivanka is visible there on a link, which we could either send anybody, or if anybody wants to inquire about that film. It's something that was made by CEQA Works and PCL and others kind of working together to show instances of how that protection is occurring. Ivanka has an extensive history of community organizing and policy advocacy around health equity, and works on holistic approaches on health and racial equity focusing on the city and county of Fresno. Ivanka, you also work with Ashley Werner, who's not able to join us this morning, but thank you for being the voice of Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability and working with us to present this morning. So thank you both, Beverly and Ivanka. Beverly, maybe we could turn to you first with questions about initiatives, referendums, and just if you can explain that set of power dynamics, please. Let me turn it over to you. Welcome.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Doug. And I'm going to pop up my slides here. Okay, has that effectively, can people, did this work? Okay, no. All right, well, thank you so much. I will be focusing on the interplay between state law and what I call the ultimate local control, which is the power of initiative and referendum. So as I'll be discussing, while citizens of this state have at their disposal powerful political tools to implement popularly desired policies at the local level, the legislature has in recent years undercut and reduced those powers, particularly in the area of housing and land use planning, both by directly attempting to limit the use of those powers and indirectly by narrowing the scope of local legislative activity. And at the conclusion, I'll talk about some of the efforts that Doug alluded to address this change dynamic by the power of initiative, and then just briefly address kind of the philosophical issues that I find inherent in this kind of tightrope between state and local control with the power of initiative. So warning, this is not a historically accurate photo, but I was looking for something to illustrate the concept of home rule. So in the 1879 Constitution, which is our state's second constitution, there was a shift in power to grant municipalities more power, as the Supreme Court said, emancipate municipal government from the authority and control formerly exercised by the legislature. The 1914 Constitution, it was amended in 1914 to give charter cities the power to make and enforce all laws and regulations in respect to municipal affairs. And this rule was retained in substance in the 1968 constitutional revision. And so what does this mean? Municipal affairs is a broad term, and it's often been defined to include planning and zoning. It's been traditionally a municipal affair, but the courts have also held that the state can regulate municipal affairs which can affect persons outside the city. And so even as far back as 1972, when the consistency requirements were first applied to general plans. I mean, apparently, I did not know this until I wrote these slides. General plans have been required since 1927, but it really wasn't until the early 70s when consistency doctrine came into play that they became, an important document that was fought over and became more contentious. And so in 1982, the Court of Appeal upheld these kind of consistency requirements. They could apply to charter cities. And so it's like Doug said, the planning and zoning law set these minimum standards that cities had to follow. But the cities were free to implement their kind of planning documents that they wanted as long as they complied with these minimum standards. So now this is a historically accurate slide. This is the Constitution. This is the ballot pamphlet from 1911. This is the cover of it. I think that 1911 was the year that voters put into the Constitution what election lawyers refer to as the reserved power of initiative and referendum. And this was put into the Constitution as a result of efforts by Governor Hiram Johnson, and it was really as a result of a reaction to the complete capture of state government by the railroad interests. And I thought that was interesting. Doug was talking about local capture and agency capture, and that is really the origin of this whole power of initiative, was to fight against that kind of capture and give power to the people. So the constitutional language is that the people reserve to themselves the power to propose laws and amendments to the Constitution and to adopt or reject the same at the polls independent of the legislature. and that the initiative and referendum powers of the people are hereby further reserved to the electors of each county, city, and town of the state to be exercised under such procedures as may be provided by law. And in 1968, this language was cleaned up and made a little more concise, but the power has always remained the same, and there's just been some slight tweaks to it since 1911. So to turn to initiatives, this is just a photo I found online of some people turning in signatures for, I don't even know what this initiative was. It's not one of mine, but they look happy. So the power of initiative is the power of the people to enact legislation. So generally what people have is the same initiative, the same legislative power as their governing body. So if a city council can enact legislation, the people acting by initiative can enact the same measure. Now there is a key difference that makes the people's power actually greater than the power of their elected officials. A city council cannot bind the hands of a future council, but the people by initiative. Once it's enacted, the initiative cannot be amended by the legislative body without approval by the voters unless the initiative specifically provides for a means of legislative amendment. An amendment is not just direct changes to the text of an ordinance. Any provision that alters the scope or applicability of an initiative is considered to amend it. And so what can be enacted by initiative: a general plan amendment, a zone change, specific plan, ordinance. I've worked on initiatives for rent control, short-term rental policies, term limits, various government operations, taxes. So there are numerous policies that are encompassed in the initiative power. There are a few things that you cannot do by initiative. You cannot enact a development agreement. You cannot, that's a pretty recent case. You can't enact contracts. Laws that name a private corporation to perform any duty are impermissible, and you can't enact a quasi-judicial entitlement like a CUP. And then generally the Supreme Court has consistently embraced a very full vision of the initiative power. For instance, one of their earlier cases on land use planning and initiative, the right to amend a general plan by initiative was challenged because the state planning and zoning law has numerous requirements that people can't comply with if they're acting by initiative. And the Supreme Court said, oh, well, that's okay. The people don't have to do those things. The local legislative body does. And also, as people might know, you don't have to comply with CEQA if you propose an initiative measure and the local government can adopt it or put it on the ballot. But there are limits that the Supreme Court has imposed. And in particular, what I think we want to focus on here is the idea of preemption. So state can fully occupy a field and prohibit conflicting local regulations. There are also a handful of cases talking about role preemption, where the state enacts a scheme and assigns roles that are so specific that the courts have inferred that the state intended to tie the hands of the public. And finally, you cannot write an initiative that interferes too much with governmental functions. And that's a sort of more nebulous concept that's a little hard to encapsulate in a brief presentation like this. But there are not so many cases where initiatives have been overturned for that problem. So the flip side of the coin is referendum. These are some people protesting a project that became very unpopular and was approved and then subject to referendum and then repealed. So referendum is when citizens vote whether or not to approve a specific piece of legislation. And it's an onerous process. For a local measure, you have to gather signatures of 10% of the voters within roughly 30 days of the passage of the ordinance. So it can be challenging. Now, there is limits to the use of referendum. You must referend a legislative act. You cannot referend a quasi-adjudicative act like a CUP, a certification of an EIR. You can referend all sorts of legislation like general plan amendments, zone changes, specific plans. And by statute, you can referend development agreements, regardless of whether those are legislative or contract. It's unclear to me, but the law specifically says they are subject to referenda. So if there are a series of entitlements necessary for a development, for instance, a general plan, a specific plan, and a development agreement, you could referend any of them or all of them. For instance, the Supreme Court has upheld the use of a referendum of a zone change where the general plan was not referended against the argument that the referendum improperly made the zoning and general plan inconsistent. The court said as long as there was a way to reconcile that inconsistency, it was okay for the general plan and zoning to become temporarily inconsistent as a result of the people's exercise of the right of referendum. And so this is another example of the Supreme Court kind of placing the power, the voters, people's reserve powers above these kind of state planning mandates. So as a result of a successful referendum, the council or supervisors must rescind a measure or put it to a vote of the people. Now, a referenda is not as powerful as an initiative in the sense that it is not necessarily as long lasting. In cities, there is a statutory bar for 1 year after a successful referendum for the voters to, for the local government to reenact a similar policy. So it's not necessarily identical, but whatever is objectionable about it. In counties, for some reason, that statute doesn't exist, but the courts have read into that a constitutional right to not have the Board of Supervisors immediately after a referendum reenact the same policy. So it's unclear exactly how long that ban applies, but at least for some reasonable period. But it's not like an initiative, which is a kind of forever act unless otherwise specified. So here we have our lovely State House. Now, I am not reporting that I'm setting forth the full extent of every legislative restriction, but I think these are the highest profile recent examples on this incursion into the right of initiative. So the first was SB 330, Housing Crisis Act of 2019, which enacted Government Code Section 66300. That provision defines the phrase affected county and affected city to include the electorate of an affected county or city, exercising its local initiative or referendum power. And it bars any affected county or affected city where housing is an allowable use on land from changing the general plan land use designation, specific plan land use designation, or zoning to a less intensive use, or changing standards to reduce intensity of use, or doing any number of things that would lessen the intensity of housing. And so this includes any initiative that would affect lessen the intensity of housing. Now you can change the land use designation to a less intensive use if the city or county concurrently changes development standards applicable to other parcels within the jurisdiction to ensure there is no net loss in residential capacity. Now it's pretty clear how this works when it comes to an initiative. If housing is a permissible use on a parcel, you cannot make changes to the zoning or general plan of that parcel or any other standards applicable to it unless you increase housing capacity elsewhere. Now, this scope of what all this means has not been litigated to my knowledge. And referenda, though, is a concept in SB 330 that is hard to understand, and it has not yet been fully litigated, though there is at least one pending appellate case on this subject. A referenda, once it's filed, it suspends the effective date of a law. So for this statute to say you cannot bring a referenda for something that changes the designation of something, when really all the referenda does is remain in the status quo. I mean, I'm just finding it's very hard to understand what the legislature was doing, but it doesn't seem to me that the referenda bar actually prohibits much of anything legally, but there have been cases in trial courts that have disagreed, and I know of one appeal that is pending on this matter. But I don't know what this means in SB 330. SB 10 is the other high profile matter, and I should say, I meant to say this at the beginning, I'm representing parties in a case challenging the constitutionality of SB 10. Nothing that I'm saying today is meant to be remarks on behalf of any party or anything to do with any pending or potential litigation. But so SB 10 allows local government to zone land in transit-rich areas or urban infill sites for up to 10 residential units per parcel, but it explicitly says that you can do this regardless of any restriction that has been applied to those parcels by local initiative. And so this was a direct effort by the legislature to give localities the power to, if they choose, override initiatives that they otherwise would not have been able to do without voter approval. And so our litigation on this issue challenged this as giving the localities an improper right to constitutionally amend. This is pending on appeal right now. The trial court said it was an exercise of valid preemption. So we will see how this all shakes out in the end, but it's a very interesting subject. So in addition to these kind of direct hits on the power of initiative and referendum, there are other housing development streamlining measures that have the effect, especially of limiting the power of referendum, but also to some extent, I think, making it easier for people to maybe work around existing initiatives or future initiatives. So these are laws like the Housing Accountability Act, which says that a proposed housing development project is not inconsistent with zoning standards and shall not require a rezoning if it is consistent with objective general plan standards and criteria, but zoning is inconsistent with the general plan. And the density bonus law, which also allows for the general plan designation of a site to prevail over the zoning. And these become important, as I'll talk about, when you consider the potential for referendum. So what have been the consequences so far? Now, I put these happy slides here because this is actually something that took place before SB 330, and I believe that SB 330 might have made the accomplishment that these folks out in Palm Springs achieved by initiative. It might have made it illegal, so it would have been harder to do. So I think it's an interesting example to consider what the consequences of this legislation could be. So for initiatives, generally, it's a little harder to, they're still happening. It's a little harder to bring a downzoning type initiative, but there are still many initiatives that I'm aware of that could have the effect of limiting housing that are consistent with SB 330. For instance, I represented some folks in San Benito County. This measure did not pass, but it would have required voter approval for future general plan amendments to agricultural and rangelands. And I think that generally is consistent with what the state wants and not inconsistent with its goals in SB 330 in the sense that the state does want to discourage sprawl development. Then in La Habra, I worked with proponents of a measure that also was aimed at protecting open space lands, but in a much more infill setting. It happened that there was a number of open space lands, both owned by the city and privately held, that voters wanted to protect and prevent future housing development on those lands. And so that was completely acceptable within SB 330 because the lands were all general plan open space. Initiative drafters do have to be more wary of possible consequences of zone changes in specific plans, but workarounds exist. I was involved in a case where a specific plan initiative would permit a warehouse store. They had to upzone neighboring properties in order to address the reduction in housing that would result from the limits in the commercial store area. But these laws, in my experience, have the potential to prevent some of this kind of conservation. So the example that I have here is out in Palm Springs. A group of citizens wrote an initiative downzoning to very low density residential and undeveloped area in the city of Palm Springs proper that was in the mountains, but there was an alluvial plain where bighorn sheep came down and used it as habitat. And it had been zoned and planned in the 80s before the bighorn were endangered species. And there was a developer who had what you said was by right entitlements to build 250 homes in this property. And so this group of citizens heard about it, got very upset, worked on an initiative taking the city's existing zoning for sensitive lands and applying it to this property, which allowed for only very low density residential development. Their city council supported it and actually adopted it outright. And then it was subject to a number of legal challenges mostly takings type, but also on election law grounds. But in the end, the state actually wound up contributing millions of dollars. Our clients raised money from the citizens of Palm Springs, and the city contributed $1 million to purchase the property outright from the developer. It's now owned by the Oswald Land Trust and will be open to the public, and is open to the public, and will be for perpetuity. It's a great result, and I don't know that these people could have gotten there without the initiative to like make that happen. They had certainly approached the developer prior to any of this, tried to just work out a deal on the property, and it was not happening. So the initiative was really super useful, and it resulted in great good out there, and it also created an amazing organization that's continued to acquire additional land in its trust. So I have to say, I don't know. I think in SB 330, because it applies in HUD designated urbanized areas, you would probably have more trouble downzoning a property like this, in spite of its obvious habitat value, in spite of the state's like total interest in preventing development there. The broad brush of SB 330, in my reading, would sweep over a property like this. So it's a challenging line to draw. So referendums still happen, but the consequences of referendums are a little bit more challenging. A lot of times the general plan amendment is approved prior to a zone change. Sometimes people aren't ready to referend it right away, and you miss your opportunity to referend the general plan. That can cause problems. Or sometimes you have a general plan that was amended a long time ago, and then you have a specific plan that comes in and you referend that. If you have a general plan designation that already says you can develop something there, under these, like the Housing Accountability Act and density bonus law, somebody can come in and build without getting a zone change. And so what we're seeing are kind of some flips that happen very quickly after referenda, where a referendum comes in and the council says, great, you referended this, but now the developer is just going to come back with a project that, you know, maybe now it includes affordable housing and it didn't before. So excellent, we got our few units, but it's not usually the objective of my clients to like just get 3 units or 5 units of affordable housing. They usually want some bigger accomplishment. So referendum are challenging and becoming a little bit more disappointing, I think, in some of these housing circumstances. So the future, Doug mentioned the Our Neighborhood Voices initiative. There was an effort in 2021 to qualify an initiative measure that would have reasserted, it was a constitutional amendment measure that would have reasserted local control over planning by kind of declaring that localities are supreme to the state in these kind of land use planning areas. This measure faced a lot of criticism from people who thought that it would undercut critical state laws like CEQA, CEHA, and other statewide environmental protection laws, which the proponents in their non-codified part of the amendment explained they did not intend to do. And so it's my understanding the proponents are coming back with a 2024 goal of a revised initiative that attempts to address these criticisms and concerns, but shifts the balance back to the local governments from what they felt was kind of a too heavy-handed approach by the state. So in conclusion, it's a balancing act here. Why is this important? Housing is one area that the state has obviously exerted a lot of pressure on local governments, but local governments are like our laboratories of democracy and laboratories of all kinds of experiments. I mean, this panel name is local creativity. And so these kind of state efforts to restrict things in the area of housing could, if they are, if these are constitutional, we could see future state governments restricting other local experiments and other local powers. I mean, we've seen this already with things like rent control, which is another effort where people are trying to push back on state limitations on local creativity. But now, is this always a positive to have local creativity? When do we cut it off? Are there are there things that we don't want local governments to be creative in? And so I think that what you will hear from our next speaker is kind of the flip side of this kind of pushback on local control, is that there are, there are reasons why the state kind of took this aggressive action on housing. And there are times when local control can be to the detriment of the public. But ultimately, I do think that the Constitution still gives the public the power to push back and to say, no, we've had enough. It's challenging to do this, but if the voters do find it's become too much, they have an out. So that takes me to the end. And I know there's a couple of questions, but we can also, I don't know, Doug, if we want to take them at the end or how you want.
Yeah. And thank you, Beverly, because I did have a question, kind of a really fundamental, but I'd like to come back to it, maybe to ask Ivanka to present, because it's also related to the question that's posed in the Q&A about if citizens were referending in order to obtain more and better affordable housing. It's not an easy question, so I'd like to hold on to it for a second and bring Ivanka, if we could hear about state programs and their implementation at the local level, and then come back to this question of how much power does the electorate kind of reserve vis-a-vis the state. But I would like to, first of all, yeah, thank you, Beverly, and turn to Ivanka to talk a bit about state programs and what it's doing and how it's being implemented at the state level.
Thank you. Let's see. Can you guys see this? See my screen okay? All right.
Yes.
Thank you, Beverly. I feel like, I could have a whole side conversation with Beverly off screen. So thank you for your presentation. I really wanted to just speak more to the city of Fresno and some of the county of Fresno as well. The misalignment between the state mandates and local authority of local jurisdictions, and give some examples of that. What we're really seeing is that there are laws to improve environmental justice, land use issues, and are in direct contrast to the priorities of the Central Valley's big ag, oil, or commercial developer land industries. And for Fresno, I really liked your first slide with the Western slide. I was like, oh, that's Fresno, in the sense that there are the power players that influence the local decision maker agencies. So big ag, oil industry, commercial land use developers, they are all also seated on a lot of our agencies, whether that's the City Council, the Fresno Council of Governments, the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control Air District. That one I kind of always laugh about because they will tout that they are a health agency first. But when you look at the makeup of the board members that decide, they are also the big ag, commercial ag people that are not going to go against the things that are best for the ag industry or the oil industry. And then lower on that level of what matters is the health of the communities. And also the county board of supervisors are also made up of those same type of industrial people. So that gives you a sense of not just the players, but who has the rights to call the shots versus the general community. And the narrative of local agencies is that the state-funded programs that have been granted to the disadvantaged communities of Fresno, because that work has been done at the state level, then it then gives them, these local agencies and power players, the right to continue to cite industrial uses of businesses in communities of color. These same state mandates that are being put in place to protect the environmental justice communities will also be the exact argument used by the power players at hand as proof that they are following the strictest guidelines. So in the spaces that I work, I wanted to lift up two examples. the work that is a lot of land use issues in the city of Fresno and county around general plans and just the siting of different types of industries. So at a state level, we have seen the attempts to protect communities, disadvantaged or environmental justice communities through two examples, AB 617, which is the Community Air Protection Plan. With this plan, it's really to reduce exposure to air pollution in historically redlined communities of color that cities have allowed the siting of high burdening land uses. So that right there goes back to a lot of what you heard when Beverly's talking about those land uses and the general planning. We're behind on the times with those dates of the general plans and those constitutional updates. So even though those updates have been in play for a very long time, you still see the consequences of Southwest Fresno, South Central Fresno, every other area of this city where the predominantly Caucasian citizens live. They get a regular update to their specific plans inside the general plans. What is your vision for your community? Whereas in the Southwest and South Central, they will go back to a plan that has been updated, but not in the sense of entailing any type of community and protections. So for us, AB 617 was a great grant that we as a community received. And unfortunately, we had to compete against a lot of other communities in California that are suffering just as bad as this community is here. And this plan allows for air monitoring and the formation of community-created emission reduction measures. So air monitoring, now there are federally regulated air monitors that are placed in South Central, South Fresno area, which ranks in the top 1% on the Cal Enviro screen of the most polluted areas. We didn't have a lot of federally regulated monitors in place by the air district. And the ones that were in place were placed in a sense that you could get manipulated data. So you're not placing them initially, monitors before 617 monitors were not placed where you're going to get the most crucial data of how much impact a community is having. So with this 617 Community Air Protection Plan, we now see air monitorings near schools that are nearest to the industries, near schools or sites that are closer to the freeways. Another part of this plan allows for the community to come up with community emission reduction measures. And they, as community members, come together on a steering committee, general public, and the air district, and come up with measures that are going to have an improvement and direct impact improvements to the community. So some of those examples are funding that came from through the California Air Resource Board, funding to help with urban greening, a truck reroute study, air filtration programs in schools. One of the things that may not necessarily need funding, some of these measures were, let's improve what's going on in our city's processes. So there was a memorandum of understanding between the air district and the city that the community wanted to see occur. And that MOU would have allowed for the community members to have a better access of the process, the awareness of when heavy and light industrial siting projects were about to come inside this 617 community. Let me step back one point. Not all of Fresno is a 617 community. It was a specific amount granted to an area. Some cities that are smaller in rural areas, it may cover the majority of their cities. But for Fresno, since we're so spread out, it really is just impacting a part of South Central and Southwest Fresno. That is where the majority of historically have housed heavy and light industrial uses in the communities of color. Because you have to remember, this is the area that was the redlined area when you talk about zoning and planning. The other side of the tracks. In our case, it was the other side of the freeways of the Highway 99 and south portion of the city of Fresno that it was defined as where those people could live, right? So this is that history consequences moving forward to today. And you have a planning department that will say, but it's always been this way. This is how we've always zoned this area, as if you just left out the historical part that was most important to state. Along that same timeline is the fact that you put every unwanted use in the areas of the people that you didn't care about. So there's this, the language that is used today directly ties to our historical past. I wanted to really just talk a little bit more about that memorandum of understanding between the Air District and the city. This was a community thought measure to be a part of this programming. And we wanted to see, as a steering committee for the communities, an opportunity to say, what is that process? How can we be more informed? Because we have a city that will, with those entitlements and the siting of industrial uses, there are 2 Amazon facilities right across the street from houses. There's an Ulta distribution facility less than 75 feet from a community of folks of about 40 homes. Nobody knows what's about to happen until the bulldozer is coming in and you're just seeing earth being moved, right? Within less than 200 feet of the backside of the Ulta distribution, there is a school. So none of these communities have been able to have the power to be involved. This program was seen at a state level that this is across the board. This isn't just Fresno. And an MOU that we attempted to get off the ground as one of those measures was to allow for a process that the community can be involved in the entire way. Because if you try as a general citizen to go to the planning department website and figure out what's happening in your city, it's very difficult to follow. There's not a lot of, there's been multiple times CEQA violation of not informing the residents of knowing when projects are happening. And so the MOU was something that we wanted to see. And the air districts will be the go-between on this, the steering committee and the city. And the city, when we started pushing with wanting some details, we want to make sure that folks are more than 1,000 feet involved with awareness of what's happening in their community. And we want to make sure that there's the siting of these, and whenever there's going to be a new project, you make sure that when it has to come to the air district to sign off on it, the air district should actually be writing comments of why this isn't the best place for the health of the community to be siting this industrial facility here. In the past, it's just a sign off. It's a check mark. It went through to the air district. You're good to go. With this 617 process, there's supposed to be a chance to have community involved in knowing, wait, have you actually gone out there and looked how close this is to a school? That process, the city just says, we don't want to be a part of this MOU. The air district is like, well, they said no, there's nothing else we can do. And then CARB is sitting at the top end involved in this process and telling us as the community, well, we can't tell you exactly how we're handling this with the air district. So there's a breakdown of enforcement, and there's a breakdown of what the California Air Resource Board, who's administering this AB 617, will actually step in and enforce. So when you have those conversations and we rally with the Air Resource Board members and the staff, it always comes back to, well, our hands are tied because there's not enough legislation. So it gets very convoluted in pointing of fingers and who has control or authority to do anything, even though there's this great plan that's been put in front of us, and we are making some progression in some of these measures, like urban greening, the air filtration in schools. Those are measures that are just kind of going to go fairly smoothly. But the ones that start touching on that land use, all of a sudden there's just like, well, we don't know what we can really do. Another program that is in the same region of South Central Southwest Fresno passed, and we were the first year that received funding under AB 2722 called the Transformative Climate Communities. This also is another law that was a plan that granted funding to be a catalyst of leveraged investments in communities that have been historically divested in, communities of color who were divested in through the general planning process, and the support and resources of their local communities, city. It will also is a community participatory process that decided on project investments that were voted on by community members. So we are now seeing a new West Fresno City College campus. It's an extension of the primary, but it is a full built out. It will be a completed full built out campus of its own. One of the other things that this is also these fundings have a lot of smaller projects that are built to actually improve the health, the economy, and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So whether that's an electric vehicle charging infrastructure project, and it's a wraparound. It's like, we know we can't just give money and say, now invest on your own. It's a wraparound of how do we reduce the greenhouse gases, improve the air, improve the quality of air, as well as improve the community and improve the community for the residents that are living here. Not this is the next best available land because we've already sprawled as far east in Fresno as we can. We now have to look as developers to sprawl west. Not for we're doing this infrastructure investment, we're putting in a new campus for the new development of housing to come, but what about the residents that are already here? And so there have been an attempt to build into that program different policies to hopefully reduce the amount of gentrification that can happen. Also in this program, we have seen with both of these that this region is the same region where the city wants to continue its industrial uses. And so there is a lack of authority to enforce the land use improvements through these programs. Both 617 and TCC were competitively granted to the same area because of the extreme historical land use practices that have led to and have allowed the overburden of industrial uses in this community of color. Yet the lack of enforcement that we see from the California Air Resource Board, the Strategic Growth Council, or our local air district state that they don't have enough ability or enforcement or authority in regards to land use. And it's really important that that is there to actually continue to progress in some of the major parts of the TCC and 617. Otherwise, it just really allows the very ineffective goals to be met. One other thing, that is really at a local level. Both of those, when Beverly was speaking about SB 330, we currently have inside of this area of the 617 and TCC area. The only way you were able to get that transformative climate communities funding is if you actually had an approved specific plan in the general plan. Community did a 2-year process to make sure that for the first time in over 50 years, a specific plan for Southwest Fresno was completed with the vision of how do we rezone and get heavy industry how do we rezone and get heavy industry away from communities? As part of that rezoning allowed for downzoning from light industrial to commercial mixed use. And not even more than 2.5 years after that plan was put in place, the property owners of land that was initially light industrial, they want it rezoned back to that, even though they have no space initially to find out where else were they going to put housing units that could have been in that space. So that's an ongoing fight that we're seeing here. And you have developers that what never happened in their fight to return to light industrial was a conversation with community saying, we are the owners of this property. What is it, community members, that we could actually change our buildings of light industrial uses to things that you want in the community? Community have said, why do we have to travel over 40 minutes to take our kids to one of those neat jump houses, the indoor trampoline houses, where you have an industrial building that could easily be converted to that? Why do we have to travel over 30 minutes to get to the nearest Target or the nearest Walmart. These big buildings could be transformed into amenities that serve the community. But that would require investment. Maybe it would require incentives from the city. The conversation of solution-based conversations has not happened. Why? Because we are in a space where developers are used to being able to go to their city council, planning department, and just say, this is what I want to do, sign off, please. And it's been happening. So that's an example. I didn't really put that one in this presentation, but it ties directly into a lot of what Beverly was talking about. One other thing that I wanted to talk about as far as examples of just the perpetuation of systemic racist practices that are helped or supported at a state level. We know that our state's plan for the Central Valley from north to south, from Sacramento down into like San Bernardino and in the empires is this whole thought of e-commerce distribution hubs for the West Coast. This is the place. We have a perfect access rail, the high-speed rail, and, north and south freeways of the 99 and the 5. What a perfect place to take economically burdened and low income citizens of the Central Valley and give them the solution, e-commerce, instead of what other ways could we really build up our economy in the Valley. And in that thought process of making that the goal, on one hand, you're thinking of the economy, get people better jobs. But on the other hand, when you're talking about the developers who are going to lead this e-commerce hub for the internal Central Valley, where the path of least resistance is going to be through the development of communities of color. So on one hand, you're thinking this is the way of the future for our state. And on the other hand, you have to, like Beverly said, a balancing act. How are you going to balance out who that's really impacting if that's how our state chooses to go? And a lot of those, what we're seeing is that those future distribution centers and heavy duty truck logistics connecting those ports, it's all going right into the disadvantaged communities of the Valley. Another project as an example is the Caltrans project in the same area that I told you about, the 617 community air protection boundaried area, which means that area should be looking at all ways to decrease pollution, decrease the types of heavy duty traffic or any type of goods, services, distribution that is an area that we're already in those census tracts overburdened. Enough is enough is what residents will tell you. And this project, because they're like, well, we're just the construction. We didn't decide to change this. This is coming from your local government that wants to see an improvement and an expansion at Highway 99 and North Avenue, which is one of the main inlets into this industrial area of South Fresno. It will expand and increase heavy duty trucks from 2 lanes to a total of 8 lanes directly into the 617 South Central community. And in this case, not only is the state not attempting to protect an EJ community, they're the front center player of this construction to continue the harm. And so those are some examples of what this looks like on the ground. And so then the question really is, what are some of those solutions? How do we move forward? Our directing attorney, Ashley, she got really ill last night and lost her voice this morning. So I'm going to take over her presentation at this point. Had she been here, she would really talk about this is the local control over the land use and the need for guardrails to honor community creativity and realize civil rights commitments. This is a picture of a rendering plant in Southwest Fresno. So over 50 years ago, back in that red line time, it was allowed for a rendering plant, which is where all our ag animals, gross to talk about, when the bodies are being converted into dog food, gummy bears, or the like, it goes to this place to be rendered. This picture does not show you that to get to this plant, you must go directly through the segregated Black community of West Fresno surface streets. And so we experience open heavy-duty trucks with their pulling carcasses of dead cows in the heat of 110-degree weather in the summertime, the stench going directly through, passing the front yards of community to get to this facility. Through a prior lawsuit, we can successfully say that this facility that was working without permits for a very long time will finally be closing at the end of 2023, early 2024. And so that's been a really big, long-standing decade fight win for the residents of Southwest Fresno. And so here, Ashley, you talked about how this government code, the general plan land use maps, designates the general land location of land uses. And for our city and the racist decision-making processes was, it's okay to put this rendering plant in this community of color. Another code also states the legislature declares its intention to provide only a minimum of limitation in order that counties and cities may exercise the maximum degree of control over local zoning matters. So through this whole fight, getting the support from a state level to who knows, and fast forward to today, all this different types of environmental or civil rights justice initiatives that are going on at the state level, laws at the state level. How will that actually trickle down when you have this code still in place? This is a map of a portion of South Central Fresno, and you can see a lot of the yellow area is actually the residential space. And the purple is where the zoning for specific planning wants to increase and become more heavy industry. And you can tell that it completely surrounds a community. The community of Kawa is a majority of along, I believe, I can't say I don't know the direct history, but definitely for decades now, it's been a majority Latino community. There is this joint evolution of racist housing and land use policies and practices that we see at a local level. You may see some new housing development in this area, but of course it's going to be a lot cheaper and not as expensive as it is to purchase the same planned house by the same developer as they would charge for you to be in the north of Fresno. So it instantly just gives you a color line delineation between a lot of farm workers or immigrant folks or historically impoverished people, regardless of color. Even the ability to move out of an area would be impossible just because the housing charge is going to be different. We don't value this land down here as much as we do in North Fresno. So there is that normalization of land use planning, directing polluting facilities to communities of color, and a lack of meaningful, if any, public process in the siting of facilities. We also see the disparities in environmental quality, public health outcomes, and access to opportunity. On that note, in our lovely city of Fresno, you can go from the South Central, Southwest Fresno area and actually breathe better into the northern parts of the city. Now, the Air District will argue, well, the wind patterns, da-da-da-da-da. What we know statistically is that if you live in South Central, Southwest Fresno, you have 20 years less to live than if you live in North Fresno. There's existing statutory environmental protections that are definitely necessary, but just aren't sufficient. Let's see, I just went down. So we do see there's this tension with evolving state goals and mandates. Here is a picture of the Carts Recycling Center in South Central Fresno. And in the upper portion of the picture, you see open dirt, open landmass, which Caglia, the the disposal business, the garbage business for our area. That is their land. They also want to expand in that. We did litigate so that they could not expand because you can't tell in this picture, but directly across the street is a line of houses. When this fire took place, they said it was started by the heat of batteries. This fire in South Central, we are seeing more and more industrial fires taking place. You have a city that just wants to lay out the red carpet for industrial uses without, I would say, fact checking CEQA, more or less finding the loopholes to state we are exempt in its CEQA eligibility instead of truly following CEQA purposes of why it was actually put in place. So state and local agencies' duties and commitments under civil rights laws and equity declarations, you have local government that will find those loopholes so that they can continue to cite these industrial uses in an area that the state has already told you, you have won at the worst. You have been competitively granted funding from the Air Resource Board and Strategic Growth Council to state enough is enough. You have to repair this community, and we are supporting you to do that. But instead, you have local government that will point to saying, thanks for the funding. Now we can continue on doing what we were doing and the same old status quo. Local government long-range planning requirements relating to environmental justice, air quality, climate adaptation, and fair housing is at a very minimal and many times aren't even meeting the requirements. State investments to improve these environmental quality in disadvantaged communities. Like I said earlier, those improvements have been put in place, but they just aren't enforceable. And the last, I think this is my last slide. Yeah, the last thing is, in this fight, we continue to try to find ways to push back. And one of the things we need to see is more proposals going to and finding authors at the legislation level, and a need for state legislation to realize civil rights and community environmental protection commitments in land use. And like Beverly has stated, it's that local level power struggle that we are seeing. Considerations about merits of state mandate and local control should include the awareness of how power operates at levels. For me, I feel like in comparison to what you've just heard from Beverly, I'm giving you like the nitty gritty examples of what this actually plays out and looks like. But you need to understand that before you go and make these new laws. So with the transformative climate communities, the state staff members actually were coming to Fresno. They were able to walk the ground. We're seeing more of that at a state level where they're getting themselves more educated on how things are playing out at a local level. And we do need to see more of that so that they can really attempt to align what theoretically sounds good on paper, but how will it actually play out and those consequences? There needs to be an evaluation of present disparities impacting protected classes and historic antecedents, and a recognition of passive and active state for activities deemed within the local purview, and intersecting state policy goals and duties. I hope this is really clear to you because there's so much that's happening at that state level and that it appears that the planning is really at a state level is where everything is more important, but you have to understand that at this local level, if we can't include different types of guardrails, a lot of work is going into programming that may not amount to anything more than being put on a shelf. So.
Well, and thank you, Ivanka. That's really powerful and helpful. I just really appreciate the presentation. There were a number of questions that arose from it and during it. I'd actually like to pose one or two of those before coming back to Beverly. There was a question really at the beginning that I don't want to miss, but come back to, like, while we're still have this fresh in our mind, questions and the presentation from Ivanka. One of them, it was answered along the way, the chicken or the egg question, the question of what I would view as kind of baked in racism, the redlining, and what comes first. But I think you covered that. And the commenter or questioner thought that was covered during your presentation. There was another about, you had also mentioned high-speed rail. And that's something that we're very curious about your thoughts on whether it's a benefit or a detriment to the historically disadvantaged environmental justice communities, or both. Do you have any thought or view about the high-speed rail?
Yeah, I don't, my purview of work that I do, we don't engage directly with high-speed rail. But one thing that high-speed rail is that tied to part of my presentation is when the transformative climate community funding first came out, our city of Fresno was all about finding funding resources to look like the best place to host and be the transfer or the station for the high-speed rail. Will it be Merced? Will it be Fresno? And how do we as a city build that up so it looks like we should be the contender for having a stop in Fresno? Then initially, and this really ties to the process of public engagement and the community power. Initially, our prior mayor was in conversation with the governor's office, and this money for TCC would completely support the improvement of downtown Fresno, and downtown Fresno needs this to be ready for that high-speed rail. When you look at the actual law that TCC stems from, it was specific to talking about this money needs to go to communities that were divested from, that have been redlined. Downtown Fresno, yes, a lot of older downtowns need revitalization, but per capita, that is not where the residents actually were living. The residents were west of the 99. And so initially in that TCC process, that funding, if there was not community pushback and fighting to get to the state and let them know you shouldn't be signing this check over to this city because that's not how the funds were meant to be spent. Initially, that money was just going to be to revitalize this 1 mile area of where the high-speed rail will eventually have a station. As far as the benefits or lack of benefits, the siting of the actual station is in our original downtown Fresno area. What we have seen is trying to make sure that TCC funding will then flow some of those projects of flow, transportation trails, real sidewalks, and real bike lanes from West Fresno that have been cut off by that highway into that rail station. So that was one part of the projects. As far as its location, it is still part of the TCC boundary. And so funding of a project, some of the funding did go to affordable housing, a new affordable housing project in the downtown Chinatown area. So that has been a benefit. As far as the construction, I have seen, and I think we've all seen this anywhere, that there has been a lot of disruption of the businesses that were taken out in the eminent domain process. And this is just an observation as a citizen that you see, dang, this whole travel station of North Fresno along the 99 was taken out in the planning. And you're thinking, what about those jobs? What about once this is finished, what did that process look like? As far as housing, for this area, there was not as much like displacement from the actual construction of houses. I don't want to speak too much to how many businesses and what the cost was to buy them out, because I just don't know that information.
And thank you. I mean, a really very thoughtful answer. It's a complex issue, so it helps to have that kind of illumination from the different sides. I would like to, and there's another question, but I really wanted to get the question that was posed during Beverly's presentation, the kind of the first one, because it goes to this, what was one of my questions even coming in here. Beverly, on the second slide, you noted that, you know, initiatives, referendum, it's a reserve power that people have not given up to the state. And it made me wonder, well, then how can the state tell people what, you know, where the limits of that power are? How can the state say, you know, this is unconstitutional or you can't do that? If it's a reserve power coming from the people to the state, then how can the state put, you know, contours on what is controlled or not? This is like the big question. And then the one that was actually posed by the audience member is, could somebody referend to obtain more affordable housing? It's sort of like if the purpose is a laudable, you know, affordable housing purpose, then can you referend to attain that purpose better? So kind of throwing it out there, and what do you think? And you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm on mute because one of my dogs is on the wrong side of my office door, and so he's howling. If you hear weird noises, I'm not torturing small children in my house. It's just a weird dog. So Doug, your big question is a really challenging one. I mean, I don't really have a clear answer. I mean, I talked about preemption, but I think that still goes back to your question is not simply, oh yeah, preemption, because it does go back to the foundational question, like the people have, the purpose of these powers of initiative and referendum was to kind of redistribute the power from the legislature to the people in direct response to all of this idea of the state government being, I mean, completely captured at that time by the railroad industry. And so the legislature was considered like the enemy of the people by the progressive movement. So Beverly, it is a good question.
Can I really appreciate also Ivanka's observation about that Western slide? It's sort of like, okay, so that wasn't historically accurate, but that's sort of like the picture of what the legislature, what the convention, you know, what California history and government was or seemed like for a long time.
Yeah, we kind of maybe, like I didn't really even until I started researching it know about that era of our state government, this whole, you know, I think of our state legislature as always, you know, not always, but often trying to be enlightened and do the right thing. And it was amazing to read just how deeply captured it was at that moment in time. And I have more of an answer to the specific question on the risk of state law preemption. I mean, I think any referendum of a development agreement is permissible because the statute is very clear that development agreements are subject to referendum and they're not listed in SB 330 as like a thing that can't be challenged. So even to the extent SB 330 ever makes sense in a referendum context, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't really seem to apply to development agreements, but I think there is a risk of state law preemption in response. I mean, yeah, there may be a disagreement on what the general plan mandates, but it seems that you could get into a situation in response to a referendum where the developer just refiles the same project with that. I guess I don't know the answer to the question whether you can enforce a specific plan mandate of a development agreement against a project that would otherwise be approved by right. So I don't know enough about the local context, and I don't think I've ever researched whether this kind of approval requirement makes sense. I know in my home city, they've kind of eliminated a lot of previous development agreements for residential development projects that otherwise conform to zoning standards because where we would have had this process. So I think you run a risk there that you will get the same project coming back and somebody say, we don't have to do this because state law says you have to approve our project ministerially. So yeah, I think some of these negotiating and previously, I think you could have gotten into a situation where you could negotiate over it and the city could enact a preferable a project could require more affordable. So I do think that some of these state mandates have the perverse incentive of kind of baking in these fairly low levels of affordable housing that are required under state law, but which sometimes especially in high cost areas, you might be able to get a little bit more affordable and make a project pencil. I'm not I don't know, but it probably depends a lot on how much your materials cost and how much you can sell or rent those units for. So I think you have to be less optimistic, I think, about your outcome of a referendum now than before there were so many kind of streamlining provisions for housing development.
Okay. And helpful. It's sort of like it was complex already, but now it's also evolving. Like there's different things more recently. So that's great kind of understanding as much as can be. So there was another question which was a bit more complex, and we may not even have a lot of information about it, but I think it illustrates some of the things that we've been discussing. This was a question about the Shasta County proposed wind power project. And to kind of boil it down, and whether for Ivanka or Beverly or both or all of us, we may just like use this as an example, but the boiled down part of it is efforts to achieve states' interest in tribal sovereignty and biodiversity seem to be undermined by a decision that the California Energy Commission is making about an opt-in program for a wind farm in AB 205. Now, I don't know a lot about all of this, and I wonder if you might, but the question raises the larger question of, the state has varying interest in tribal sovereignty, biodiversity, and climate change. And then how to meet all those. I guess I want to ask it back to you guys if like there's a specific answer to this question about AB 205 and the Shasta County Wind Farm Program, or a larger answer about varying interests at both the state and local level anyway, and how they compete with each other. Yeah,
well, I know nothing about AB 205, and this is the first time I've ever heard of it. So I definitely don't have a specific answer, but I will say that this is the kind of tension that is reflected in some of the cases evaluating the people's initiative power. For instance, a case out of Orange County that is a little bit aged now, but is still a good law called Cost, that looked at whether an individual city could pass a law like banning construction of a freeway through, I'm simplifying it, but basically preventing the local government from collecting taxes that would, fund this freeway project that local citizens found objectionable in Irvine. And the court said, this was like one of these rare cases where the court was like, no, this is too specifically allocated to these local government bodies. Like you can't, as like one group of citizens, say, we don't want this thing and in particular, they did look at this idea of statewide interest and the kind of network effect of highways. So I think with the energy issue, you get into that tension a little bit because of energy flowing across borders. I see the questioner says that the county doesn't need the electricity, but it is, it would serve a grid, of course. And so the question is like, I know nothing, there's no comment on AB 205 and how it would or wouldn't apply, but just thinking about it generally from a preemption standpoint, is this the kind of project where there is a statewide interest in that would override these other interests, and these other interests are also, of course, state interests. And so it's very complicated balancing question that has some analog in this kind of road network, and also there are some cases about airports that also kind of touch on these themes. And so where you see these, broad projects that have the potential to transgress political boundaries, the courts do get a little bit less deferential to local control. And so I wonder about how that balance would be struck here.
And Beverly, your observations there remind me, and this may be more kind of asking Ivanka your thoughts, because on the energy grid, it seems like that setup might be a place where it was set up years ago. The powers that be or were set it up for their benefit and continued kind of implementation. So when you have some sort of system or effort by communities to feed into the existing grid or work with it or changes. I wonder if they're facing similar issues with the land use questions of, you know, redlining is so deeply ingrained for years, it's hard to undo it today. And, you know, even working with incentives and investments, there's pushback and resistance. So I guess I just wondered to think in terms of the energy generation and distribution system, and whether that is also susceptible or historically worth examining for how it's been created and kind of questioning fundamental assumptions, how it's set up.
Yeah, I unfortunately, I have no knowledge on 205 or can't really speak to any of the energy issues on that level. For Fresno, we do also see that the regional wastewater treatment center is west of the West Fresno. It's in the county portion. And so we do see issues of those on my team that lead a lot of our water work and water rights have to follow those issues of as you expand and sprawl in other parts of the city, how is it going to impact the flow? And as they are increasing that same area with solar panels and solar energy on that plant, at that plant, how is that going to impact the communities that are already overburdened? We have seen large electrical transformers more being placed in areas of West Fresno that we didn't take on those energy fights, but would have been a lot harder of a fight to have placed those large electrical transformers in North Fresno communities, whereas here it's just like, well, we're only upgrading what was already here. So there is that gray area that you will see, even in the face of environmental justice issues, it's still a push through for many types of projects.
Mm-hmm. And thank you. I recognize that, you know, this is something that while none of us is familiar with the particular bill, it identifies some issues that I think are of great common concern. And I see that we're here at the end, unless there's, if you guys would like any closing observations or kind of review panel thoughts, either Beverly or Ivanka. You don't have to, because we're right at 10:30, but I want to leave you the room and opportunity. And so I'll just ask the audience, like if it were in person, to join me in really appreciating you guys and like giving, you know, a round of applause or, you know, mark on your participants or comments. Really, really appreciate both of you, Ivanka, Beverly, for coming and sharing your knowledge, expertise, and insights with us this morning. Great kickoff to the assembly for Planning Conservation League. And so really appreciate your time this morning. So Howard, want to take it away and carry us out?
Thanks so much, Doug, and thanks very much to Beverly and Ivanka for your time and for your presentation. This is great conversation. It doesn't end here. This discussion and debate is going to continue for a while. Planning Conservation League has kind of been part of a bigger process at the state capitol regarding this conversation, and many of our allies and some of our strategic partners that have been at this table for a while with trying to figure out this balance. You know, I liked your slide, Beverly. It was a good picture of someone on the tightrope. So thank you again for starting and kicking us off. Good question on offshore wind. That's just a little prompt. We are going to, excuse me, on the wind question, the wind farm question. We are going to have a panel next week actually on offshore wind. This is something that PCL is getting involved in now, that California has been dragged into this, and we have 2 sites that have just came out with their initial leasing options last year. So we're going to be engaging in that conversation. And that bill 8205, we did actually have a little bit of engagement with previously, and that's going to be an ongoing conversation and monitoring process as the commission work that. So good question on that one. All right, so thank you again very much. We're going to take a 15-minute break here. We're going to start our next session at 10:45. You're welcome to stay online, or you're welcome to sign out and sign back in, however you want to do that is your preference. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody starting back up here at 10:45. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Howard.
you. Thanks for
Thanks,
having me.
everybody. Yeah.